Episode 3, The Courtroom Battle. When the court's summons arrived in the mail, it felt like a tangible marker of how far things had unraveled. Amy and I had barely spoken in days. The silence between us had become suffocating, a constant reminder of the betrayal that lay at the heart of our crumbling marriage. I had spent hours with Vicky, piecing together every shred of evidence to ensure my case was airtight. The flash drive containing the photos, emails, and messages sat at the center of it all. The indisputable proof that Amy's actions were more than just a misunderstanding, they were deliberate choices. "Mark, we've got a strong case," Vicky reassured me during our final pre-trial meeting. Her sharp eyes locked onto mine as she slid a folder across the table. "I've reviewed every detail. With the evidence you've provided, she doesn't stand a chance." Her confidence was reassuring, but it didn't make the situation any easier. Taking my wife to court wasn't something I had ever imagined. I wasn't just fighting for justice. I was fighting to protect my children, my future, and my dignity. The morning of the trial, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie with trembling hands. The reflection staring back at me looked older, more worn than I remembered. Stress had taken its toll, carving lines into my face that hadn't been there before. Amy was already gone, having left the house early to meet with her own attorney. I didn't know what her strategy would be, but I knew she would try to paint herself as the victim. It was a move I had prepared for, thanks to Vicky's meticulous planning. I arrived at the courthouse feeling a mix of dread and determination. The courtroom was small but imposing, its wooden benches and high ceilings lending an air of gravity to the proceedings. Amy was already seated at the defendant's table, her posture stiff and defensive. She glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable, before looking away. Vicky placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Remember, Mark, the truth is on your side. Let her try to spin her story. We'll dismantle it piece by piece." The proceedings began with opening statements. Amy's attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Greg Walters, painted a picture of a misunderstood wife who had made a single mistake. "My client acknowledges her actions and deeply regrets the pain they have caused," he said smoothly. "But let us not forget that marriage is a complex partnership, one where both parties share responsibility for its successes and failures. This case is not about punishment, it's about understanding and resolution." I clenched my fists under the table, resisting the urge. Greg's words were carefully crafted, designed to shift the blame back onto me without directly accusing me of anything. Vicky, however, was ready. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with an air of quiet authority, her voice steady and unwavering. "Your Honor, this case is not about a single mistake," she began. "It is about a pattern of deceit, betrayal, and manipulation. My client, Mark Butler, is not here out of anger or spite. He is here to seek justice for the trust that was broken and the damage that was done to his family. The evidence will show that this was not an isolated incident but a deliberate choice made without regard for the consequences." The first few hours were grueling. Greg called Amy to the stand, where she delivered a tearful testimony about feeling neglected and unloved. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling, but it wasn't out of malice. "I was lonely. I thought it was harmless." Her words were rehearsed, her tears carefully timed, but as she spoke, I felt a flicker of doubt in the courtroom. She was convincing, I had to admit that. For a moment, I worried that the judge might actually believe her version of events. Then it was Vicky's turn. "Mrs. Butler," she began, her tone calm but firm, "you stated that your actions were the result of loneliness and neglect. Is that correct?" "Yes," Amy replied, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "And yet, you never brought these concerns to your husband's attention. Why not?" Amy hesitated, glancing at Greg for guidance. I didn't think he would understand." Vicky nodded as if she expected that answer. "So instead, you decided to use a so-called hall pass, a concept that your husband had explicitly rejected. Is that correct?" Amy's face flushed. "It wasn't supposed to be real. It was just something we joked about years ago." Vicky reached into her folder and pulled out the photo of Amy and Joshua Morrow, placing it on the evidence table. "Does this look like a joke to you, Mrs. Butler?" The courtroom fell silent as everyone's eyes turned to the photo. Amy's expression in the picture was unmistakable, radiant, giddy, and completely at ease with the man beside her. Amy shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she mumbled. "Let's talk about how far it went," Vicky pressed, her voice unwavering. She held up a printout of Amy's messages to Jenny. In these messages, you described your night with Mr. Morrow as amazing. You also mentioned plans to meet him again. Were those plans a joke as well? Amy's composure cracked. I wasn't serious about that. Vicky turned to the judge. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. This was not a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. It was a deliberate betrayal of her marriage vows. The climax of the trial came when Vicky introduced a private investigator who had been hired to verify Amy's story. The investigator revealed that the man Amy had believed to be Joshua Morrow wasn't the actor at all. He was a con artist who had a history of posing as a celebrity to exploit vulnerable women. Gasps filled the courtroom as the revelation sank in. Amy's face turned ghostly pale, her hands trembling as she stared at the investigator in disbelief. This man, Vicky concluded, pointing to a photo of the imposter, deceived Mrs. Butler, but that does not absolve her of her actions. She chose to pursue this relationship, knowing full well what it would mean for her family. By the time the judge adjourned for the day, the weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. Amy sat frozen at the defendant's table, her head bowed in defeat. As I left the courtroom, Vicky walked beside me, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. You did great today, Mark, she said. The truth is out there now. Let's see how the judge rules. The second day of the trial started with a tension that was almost suffocating. Walking into the courthouse, I could feel the weight of what had already been revealed. The evidence Vicky had presented was irrefutable, and the bombshell about the man Amy had believed to be Joshua Morrow being a con artist had left her shaken. But despite her obvious discomfort, I knew Amy wouldn't go down without a fight. She was sitting at the defendant's table when I arrived, her posture rigid and her face blank. She barely glanced in my direction. The confident, self-assured woman I had once known was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Vicky leaned over to me as we settled in. Stay composed, Mark. They're going to push hard today, but we've got this. I nodded, gripping the edge of the table. Greg Walters, Amy's attorney, began the morning by calling Amy's best friend, Jenny, to the stand. Jenny had always been a supportive presence in Amy's life, and I could see why Greg thought she might sway the court in Amy's favor. Jenny walked in, her face a mask of nervousness. She avoided my gaze entirely, her eyes fixed on Greg as he guided her through her testimony. Jenny, he began smoothly, you've known Amy for years. Would you say she's a good mother, a loving wife? Jenny nodded quickly. Yes, absolutely. Amy loves her family more than anything. And would you say that her actions during the incident in question were out of character for her? Jenny hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Amy. I think Amy made a mistake. She's only human. Greg smiled as if her words were a victory. Exactly, a mistake. We all make them, don't we? Thank you, Jenny. He turned to Vicky, signaling that she could begin her cross-examination. Vicky rose gracefully, her expression calm but steely. Jenny, you stated that Amy's actions were a mistake, is that correct? Yes, Jenny said, her voice small. And yet, Vicky continued, picking up a stack of printed emails. In these messages between you and Amy, she described the night as amazing and stated, I've never felt so alive. Do those sound like words of someone who thought they were making a mistake? Jenny's face flushed, and she fidgeted in her seat. I don't know. She was caught up in the moment. I guess. Vicky pressed on, her tone unwavering. In those same messages, Amy also mentioned wanting to see the man again. Were you aware of that? Jenny's shoulders slumped. Yes, but she didn't mean it. She was just venting. Vicky held up a photo of Amy and the imposter, her arm draped around him, her expression radiant. Does this look like venting to you, Jenny? Jenny had no answer. Her silence speaks volumes. The next portion of the trial focused on financial records. Vicky presented bank statements and credit card receipts that painted a clear picture of the night Amy had spent with the imposter. From the upgraded hotel room to the club charges, every detail was laid bare. Greg tried to argue that these expenses didn't prove anything, but Vicky was relentless. These charges, she said, her voice echoing through the courtroom, corroborate the timeline of events we've already established. Amy's actions weren't impulsive, they were planned. Amy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. As the day wore on, the judge allowed a brief recess. I stepped outside the courtroom, the cool air hitting me like a much-needed reset. Vicky joined me, handing me a bottle of water. "You're doing great, Mark," she said. "Stay focused, we're almost there." I nodded, though the weight of the situation felt heavier than ever. When the recess ended, it was time for me to take the stand. My palms were sweaty as I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Sitting there under the gaze of the judge, the attorneys, and Amy, I felt the full gravity of the moment. Vicky began her questioning gently, guiding me through my testimony. I explained how I had discovered Amy's betrayal, from the phone call to the evidence I had uncovered. I spoke about the impact it had on me, on our family, and on my sense of trust. "Mark," Vicky said, her tone softening, "what do you hope to achieve through these proceedings?" I took a deep breath, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I want to protect my children and ensure that they grow up in an environment where trust and respect are valued. I want Amy to take responsibility for her actions, and I want to move forward with my life in a way that allows me to rebuild what was broken." Greg's cross-examination was harsher. He tried to paint me as a controlling husband, accusing me of overreacting to a single mistake. "You claim this was a betrayal," he said, his voice sharp, "but isn't it true that you went through Amy's private belongings without her consent?" "Yes," I admitted, meeting his gaze, "and I did it because she wasn't being honest with me. I needed to know the truth." Greg smirked as if he thought he had caught me. "So, in a way, you betrayed her trust too." I held my ground. "The difference is, I did it to uncover the truth about her betrayal. She did it because she didn't care about mine." The final proof came when Vicky called the private investigator to the stand again. This time, he revealed text messages between the imposter and Amy. Messages that Amy had tried to delete but were recovered during the investigation. In one of the messages, Amy had written, "That was the most exciting night of my life. I can't stop thinking about you." The courtroom was silent as the investigator read the message aloud. Amy's face turned ghostly pale, and she slumped back in her chair as if the air had been knocked out of her. By the time the judge adjourned for the day, I felt both drained and vindicated. The evidence was overwhelming, and Amy's attempts to deflect blame had crumbled under the weight of the truth. As I left the courthouse, I glanced back at Amy. She looked small, defeated, her earlier confidence completely shattered. Vicky walked beside me, her expression one of quiet triumph. "We're close, Mark," she said. "The judge has everything they need to make a fair ruling. Be proud of how you handled yourself today." I nodded, though the victory felt bittersweet. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about closing a chapter of my life that I had never imagined would end like this. The third day of the trial was the most grueling yet. By this point, all the evidence had been presented, the witnesses questioned, and the truth laid bare. Amy's betrayal wasn't just a mistake anymore, it was a deliberate series of actions that had left our marriage in ruins. I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped tightly together as the judge called the court to order. Amy was seated a few feet away, her expression blank but her posture tense. I could see the exhaustion in her face, the weight of the past few days bearing down on her, but I couldn't let myself feel sympathy, not after everything that had come to light. Vicky leaned over to me as the judge began reviewing the case. "This is it," she whispered. "Stay calm, no matter what happens." I nodded, though my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The judge's voice filled the courtroom, steady and measured as they summarized the key points of the case. "The evidence presented by the plaintiff has been thorough and compelling," the judge began, their gaze sweeping across the room. "It is clear that the defendant engaged in actions that violated the trust and sanctity of the marital relationship. While the defendant has argued that these actions were the result of emotional neglect, the evidence suggests otherwise. The pattern of deception and the deliberate nature of the defendant's choices cannot be ignored." Amy shifted in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Greg Walters, her attorney, sat beside her, his face carefully composed. The judge continued, addressing the impact on our children. "In cases like this, the court's priority is always the well-being of the children involved. It is the court's belief that a stable, trustworthy environment is essential for their development." I held my breath as the judge paused, glancing at their notes. "Therefore, the court grants primary custody of the children to the plaintiff, Mark Butler. The defendant, Amy Butler, will retain visitation rights as determined by the court. Additionally, the plaintiff's request for spousal support is granted, given the financial implications of the defendant's actions." A wave of relief washed over me, though it was tinged with sadness. I had won. but the victory came at a cost. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, I glanced at Amy. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she simply stood and walked out of the courtroom without a word. Vicky turned to me, a small smile on her lips. "You did it, Mark. It's over." I nodded, though it didn't feel like a victory. The trial was over, but the fallout was just beginning. When I returned home that evening, the house felt different, emptier, quieter. The kids were still at my parents' house, giving me a chance to process everything on my own. I walked through the rooms, each one filled with memories of a life I had thought was unshakable. Now, those memories felt tainted, overshadowed by the betrayal that had brought everything crashing down. I found myself in the living room, staring at a photo of our family taken years ago. Amy was smiling brightly, her arms wrapped around the kids. I looked at her face, searching for any sign of the woman I had once loved, but all I could see now was the version of her who had lied to me, who had chosen her own desires over our family. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Amy standing there. She looked fragile, her makeup smeared from tears she had clearly been crying all the way over. "Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling, "can I come in?" I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. She entered the house slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings as if seeing them for the first time. I wanted to talk," she began, sitting down on the couch. I stayed standing, keeping a safe distance. "About what, Amy?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and desperation. "About everything. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I need you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry." I crossed my arms, my expression unreadable. "Sorry doesn't change what happened. It doesn't fix the damage you've done." "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking, "but I can't lose you, Mark. I can't lose our family." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of the love we had once shared, but it was quickly drowned out by the memory of her lies. "It's too late, Amy," I said quietly. "The trust is gone, and without trust, there's nothing left to rebuild." Tears streamed down her face, and she buried her head in her hands. "I don't know how to fix this," she sobbed. "You can't," I said firmly, "and that's something you're going to have to live with." After she left, I sat in silence, my thoughts racing. The trial was over, but the wounds it had opened would take much longer to heal. I had won custody of the kids and taken the first steps toward rebuilding my life, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. As I prepared to pick up the kids from my parents' house, I made a silent promise to myself. I would move forward, no matter how difficult it was. Amy's betrayal had shattered our marriage, but it wouldn't define the rest of my life. Episode 4, Fallout and Redemption. The first few weeks after the trial felt like I was navigating through a fog, each step heavy with uncertainty. The courtroom may have declared a victory in my favor, granting me primary custody of the kids and spousal support, but in reality, the emotional battle was far from over. Winning didn't feel triumphant, it felt hollow. The house was quieter now, emptier. Amy's presence had been a constant for so many years, and while I had prepared myself for this new reality, the absence of her laughter, her footsteps, and her perfume lingering in the air, it was unsettling. I threw myself into routines to keep the kids' lives as stable as possible. Homework, dinner, bedtime stories, it all became part of a ritual that anchored me. I wanted them to feel safe, loved, and unaffected by the chaos that had unfolded between their parents. But the truth was, kids are perceptive. One evening, as we sat at the dining table finishing homework, Emma, my eldest, looked up from her math problems. "Dad?" she asked hesitantly, her pencil hovering over the paper. "Yeah, sweetheart?" I replied, my attention shifting to her. "Why doesn't Mom live here anymore?" The question hit me, makes me ache. I knew it was coming eventually, but I wasn't prepared for it. I set my fork down and took a deep breath. "Well," I began carefully, "sometimes adults make mistakes, and when those mistakes happen, it can change things, but what's important is that your mom and I both love you very much. No matter what, that will never change." Emma nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in thought. "But can't people fix their mistakes?" Her words cut deeper than I expected. "Sometimes they can," I said, my voice soft, "but other times, the damage is too big, and when that happens, the best thing we can do is focus on making things better moving forward." Emma seemed to accept the answer, though her expression remained pensive. "I miss when we were all together," she said quietly. I reached over and pulled her into a hug. "I know, honey, I miss it too, but we're going to be okay, I promise." Despite the challenges, I was determined to give the kids a sense of normalcy. I signed them up for soccer practice and art classes, activities they had always loved. On weekends, we visited the park, baked cookies, or watched movies together. Every moment felt like a small victory, a reminder that life could go on, even if it wasn't the same. But the nights were the hardest. Once the kids were asleep, the silence of the house became deafening. Memories of Amy and our life together crept in, uninvited and unrelenting. I found myself replaying old arguments, moments of laughter, and the day I first realized she had betrayed me. A few weeks after the trial, Amy called me. Her voice was hesitant, almost fragile. "Mark," she began, "I was wondering if we could meet, just to talk." I hesitated. The thought of seeing her again, of facing the woman I loved who cheated on me, was both painful and daunting, but a part of me was curious to see if she had finally come to terms with the consequences of her actions. "Okay," I said eventually. "When and where?" We agreed to meet at a small cafe we used to frequent before everything fell apart. Walking into the familiar space felt strange, like stepping into a memory that no longer belonged to me. Amy was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table. She looked different, tired, subdued, her usual confidence replaced by a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. "Hi," she said softly as I sat down across from her. "What do you want, Amy?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She fiddled with the edge of her coffee cup, her eyes downcast. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally. "I know I've said it before, but I need you to know that I mean it. I was wrong, Mark, about everything." Her words surprised me. I had expected excuses, defensiveness, anything but this. "I was selfish," she continued, her voice trembling. "I thought I could have it all, a fantasy, a perfect family, everything, but I was wrong. I traumatized the one thing that mattered most to me." I studied her carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity, but her expression was raw, her tears genuine. "Why now?" I asked quietly. "Why are you saying this now?" "Because I've had time to think," she said, her voice breaking, "and I realize now that I didn't just hurt you, I hurt our kids. I hurt myself. I don't expect you to forgive me, Mark, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her of every lie, every betrayal, but another part of me, the part that had loved her for 15 years, felt a flicker of empathy. After that meeting, I found myself reflecting on what forgiveness meant. Could I ever truly forgive Amy? Could I let go of the anger and resentment that had consumed me since her betrayal? One night, as I sat alone in the quiet of the house, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about her. It wasn't about absolving her of what she had done. It was about freeing myself from the weight of it all. Holding on to the anger was exhausting, and it wasn't helping me or the kids. I didn't have to forget what Amy had done, but I could choose to let go of the bitterness. The next time Amy came to pick up the kids, I greeted her at the door. "Hey," I said, my tone softer than it had been in months. She looked surprised but nodded. "Hi." As the kids ran to her car, I took a deep breath. "I want you to know that I'm trying," I said, "not for us, but for them. They deserve to have both of us in their lives, even if things aren't the same." Amy's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded again. "Thank you, Mark, that means a lot." It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a small, tentative step toward healing. Until days during Emma's parent-teacher conference, Amy and I had agreed to attend together, something that sounded reasonable in theory but was painfully awkward in practice. When I arrived at the school, Amy was already there, sitting in one of the chairs outside the classroom. "Hi," she said cautiously, her voice soft. "Hi," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. We sat in uncomfortable silence until the teacher invited us in. As the meeting began, I found myself focusing more on Amy's behavior than the teacher's words. She seemed subdued, almost nervous, and I couldn't tell if it was because of guilt or something else. When the teacher praised Emma's performance, Amy's face lit up with pride. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had once loved, the mother of my children, who had always been so devoted to them. But the moment passed quickly, and the awkward tension returned. After the meeting, as we walked out of the school, Amy turned to me. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly. I nodded. "Of course, it's for Emma." She hesitated as if she wanted to say more, but in the end, she just nodded and walked away. The kids, though young, were starting to sense the changes in their world. Emma's questions about why Amy wasn't living with us anymore had grown more frequent, and my younger son, Kevin, had become unusually clingy. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, he wrapped his tiny arms around my neck and wouldn't let go. "Don't leave, Daddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. I felt my heart break. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy," I said softly, stroking his hair. "Is Mommy coming back?" he asked, looking up at me with wide, innocent eyes. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Mommy loves you very much," I said finally, "but no, she's not coming back to live here, but you'll still see her, just like you always do." He nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't fully understand. Co-parenting brought its own set of challenges. Amy's visits were emotionally charged, with the kids running to her with excitement while I stood back, feeling like an outsider in my own home. There were moments when she tried to engage with me, asking how the kids were doing, offering to help with school projects, but I kept my answers short and polite. One evening, after dropping the kids off with Amy for the weekend, I found myself alone in the house, the silence almost unbearable. I sat in the living room, staring at the framed photos on the wall. Most of them were of the kids, but there were a few of Amy and me, smiling, carefree, from a time when things were simpler. I felt a pang of nostalgia. How had we gone from that to this? A week later, I received an unexpected call from Amy. "Mark," she said, her voice hesitant, "can we talk? In person?" I sighed, already dreading whatever this was about. "What is it, Amy?" I want to talk about the kids, and about us," she said. "There is no us, Amy," I replied sharply. "I know," she said quickly, "I know that, but I want to talk about how we can move forward. Please, Mark, just one conversation." After a long pause, I reluctantly agreed. We met at the same cafe as before, though this time, the tension between us was even heavier. Amy looked nervous as she sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything," she began, her voice trembling, "but I want us to be able to work together for the kids." I studied her carefully. "What exactly are you asking for?" "I just want us to be able to communicate," she said, "to make decisions together about the kids without all this anger between us." Her words surprised me. I had expected excuses or deflection, but this felt genuine. "I don't know, Amy," I said honestly. "It's hard to move past the anger when everything you did is still so fresh." "I understand," she said, tears welling in her eyes, "and I'm not asking you to forgive me, I just want to be better for them." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. For so long, I had seen her as the villain in this story, the person who had shattered our family. But now, I saw a woman who was broken, trying to piece herself back together. After that meeting, I found myself thinking about what co-parenting could look like. Could we really set aside our past and focus solely on the kids? It wouldn't be easy, but for their sake, I was willing to try. The next weekend, when Amy came to pick up the kids, I made an effort to engage with her. "Emma has a recital coming up," I said. "It's next Friday at 6. You're welcome to come." Her eyes lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Mark, I'll be there." It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a step toward building a new kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect and a shared love for our children. The days following Amy's first apology blended into a routine that felt as fragile as walking on thin ice. While her words at the cafe had been heartfelt, the damage she had done to our family made trusting her again almost impossible. Still, as much as I wanted to shut her out, I couldn't. Our kids were the bridge that connected us, no matter how broken the foundation beneath it had become. Co-parenting with someone you no longer trust is a delicate dance. Every interaction felt like a test, every decision a potential flashpoint. But for the sake of Emma and Kevin, I resolved to keep things civil. They didn't deserve to carry the burden of our mistakes. One of the first major challenges we faced as co-parents was planning Emma's 9th birthday. Normally, this would have been a shared effort. Amy and I would have brainstormed ideas together, picking out decorations and deciding on themes. But this year, things were different. Amy called me a week before the party, her tone hesitant. "Mark, I know this is awkward, but I was wondering if we could plan Emma's birthday together. She's really excited about it, and it would mean a lot to her if we both were involved." I paused, weighing her request. The idea of spending hours with Amy, pretending everything was fine, made my stomach churn, but Emma deserved a happy birthday, and I couldn't let my personal feelings overshadow her special day. "For Emma, I'll do it," I said finally, "but let's keep it about her. No arguments, no drama." "Agreed," Amy said quickly, relief evident in her voice. The day of the party arrived, and I made sure to get to the venue early. I busied myself with hanging balloons and arranging the decorations, trying to focus on the task at hand instead of the tension brewing beneath the surface. Amy arrived shortly after, carrying a box of supplies. For the next hour, we worked side by side in near silence, occasionally exchanging short comments about where to place the banners or how to set up the dessert table. It felt strange, like working with a stranger who just happened to know every detail of your life. When Emma arrived, her face lit up with joy. Seeing her excitement was worth every uncomfortable moment. She ran around the room with her friends, laughing and playing, completely unaware of the tension between her parents. As she blew out the candles on her unicorn-themed cake, I couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and sadness. We had managed to give her a moment of happiness, but it was bittersweet knowing that our family would never be whole again. After the guests left and the party wound down, Amy approached me. "Thank you for doing this," she said quietly. I nodded, keeping my tone even. "It was for Emma." "I know," she said, her voice laced with regret, "but I appreciate it all the same." Despite moments of cooperation, the cracks in our relationship were still there, threatening to widen at any moment. Co-parenting required constant communication, and every phone call or text felt like a potential minefield. One particularly tense disagreement arose over Kevin's upcoming parent-teacher conference. Amy wanted us to attend together, but I hesitated. The idea of sitting beside her in a small classroom, pretending everything was fine, made my stomach knot. "Mark, this isn't about us," she said over the phone. "It's about Kevin. He deserves to have both of his parents there." Her words struck a chord. As much as I wanted to avoid her, I couldn't let my discomfort take precedence over what was best for our son. "Fine," I said reluctantly, "but let's keep it professional." At the conference, the teacher praised Kevin's progress, highlighting his creativity and enthusiasm for learning. Amy beamed with pride, and for a brief moment, we shared a mutual sense of accomplishment as parents. "He's doing so well," Amy said as we walked to the parking lot afterward, her voice filled with emotion. "He is," I agreed, allowing a small smile to slip through. For a fleeting moment, it felt like we were on the same team again, but the moment passed quickly, and the barriers between us returned. The real test of our co-parenting arrangement came when Amy asked for additional time with the kids. "Mark," she said during one of our exchanges, "I know the court set a schedule, but I was wondering if I could have them for an extra weekend this month. It's my mom's birthday, and she'd love to see them." My first instinct was to say no. The court-ordered arrangement was there for a reason, and deviating from it felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to open. But then I thought about the kids. They adored their grandmother, and I didn't want my resentment toward Amy to get in the way of their relationship. "Okay," I said finally, "but just this once. Don't make a habit of asking for exceptions." Amy nodded, gratitude flashing across her face. "Thank you, Mark, it means a lot." Through these small steps, a fragile truce began to form. While the bitterness I felt toward Amy hadn't disappeared, I could see that she was making an effort. Whether it was motivated by genuine remorse or a desire to rebuild her image, I wasn't sure, but for the kids' sake, I was willing to try. One night, as I tucked Kevin into bed, he looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, are you and Mommy friends now?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "We're working on being better for you and Emma," I said finally. He nodded, his little face serious. "I hope you don't fight anymore." I kissed his forehead, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Me too, buddy, me too." Despite the progress we were making, there were still moments that tested my patience. One Saturday morning, Amy arrived to pick up the kids and lingered at the door. "Mark," she began, her tone hesitant, "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you." I blinked, surprised. "Proud of me? For what?" "For how you've handled all of this," she said, The kids are thriving because of you. I see that now, and I just wanted to acknowledge it." Her words disarmed me. For so long, I had been bracing for conflict, expecting her to push my buttons, but this felt different, genuine, even. "Thank you," I said cautiously. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. As she walked away, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to navigate this new chapter with a little less pain and a little more grace.